If you'll raise your hand, we'll get that count first. And we do still have some study books. If you'd like to have one of the quarterly books, Barry's coming down and handing those out. If you've not been able to get one, would like to have one to follow along, raise your hand, and you're welcome to one. We are in lesson 9. We're in lesson 9, and it's primarily on the first part of Joshua chapter 10. As everyone's turning there, we had a good event last night at our house, and I just wanted to say to all that were able to come out that we appreciate you being there, and I believe all the kids had a good time. I'm a little sniffly from the fire. I stood in the fire a little more than I probably should have, cooking on the grill. And so I may be sniffing my way through this, but we had a good time. The kids were, some of the kids were worn out. Jessica told me Mary Pat was running circles when she got home. So, but we had a good time. I'm glad everyone who got to come out was able to. As I said, we're in chapter 10 of Joshua, and the title of this lesson is "The Sun Stands Still." And as I started looking at that, you kind of think that might be the focus of the lesson, something about that miraculous event. And as I started reading through it, that comes along towards the end of this lesson. And as I was preparing what I was going to go over, it really kind of took as strangely as it sounds, it really kind of took a back seat to me and everything else that was going on. And so we'll talk about the lead up to it, and then we'll talk a little bit about that event of the sun standing still at the end of this battle. But in order to get into this lesson, I want to do just a little bit of background. Chris taught last week, and I know he covered what was going on in the first part of chapter 9. But just for the benefit of those who weren't here, I want to set the stage a little bit for what's going on here in the first part of chapter 10. In chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, just a little recap, and it came to pass when all the kings who were on this side of the Jordan, in the hills and in the lowland, and in all the coasts of the great sea towards Lebanon, or Lebanon, I guess, it should be proper, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite heard about it, that they gathered together to fight with Joshua and Israel with one accord. So these kings, these other nations, are starting to hear word of what the Israelites and what Joshua is doing through the land. They heard about their conquests, especially Ai and what he had done to the kings there. You back up a little bit more, chapter 8 and verse 29, and the king of Ai, he hanged on a tree until evening, and as soon as the sun went down, Joshua commanded that they should take his corpse down from the tree, cast it at the entrance of the gate of the city, and raise over it a great heap of stones that remains to this day. So these kings and these nations were hearing about these conquests, and they had to kind of come to a solution. How are we going to handle it? Some of the kings banded together to fight against Joshua, and that's really what today is. And some of the kings, one especially, tried to make peace. And that was last week's lesson, and I'm not going to go into it in any more detail other than to say that the deception of Gibeon made peace with Israel. That Israel shouldn't have accepted, but they did. And so that's where we find ourselves now with Gibeon and Israel in a form of a peace treaty, however you want to put it. And we'll pick up now with verse 22 of chapter 9. Then Joshua called for them, and he spoke to them, saying, "Why have you deceived us, saying, "We are very far from you, and you dwell near us. Now, therefore, you are cursed, and none of you shall be freed from being slaves, woodcutters and water carriers for the house of my God." So they answered Joshua and said, "Because your servants were clearly told that the Lord your God commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land, and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. Therefore we were very much afraid for our lives because of you, and have done this thing. And now here we are in your hands. Do with us as seems good and right to do to us." So he did to them, and delivered them out of the hand of the children of Israel, so that they did not kill them. And that day Joshua made them woodcutters and water carriers for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord, in the place which he would choose, even to this day. And so, we get further confirmation here that that the word of what the nation of Israel was doing was spreading. These people knew even the history of Israel, knew that God had told Moses that we're going to give these lands to you, and they were afraid, and so they set up this ruse and got this peace treaty with Israel, and that sets up now this lesson, because you have this fairly important nation of city of Gibeon that was also had its 4 cities. That would have been, when you're looking at it from the perspective of the other nations around, something they wouldn't want. It was clear enough that Israel on its own was wreaking havoc, destruction of Ai and killing the king and whatever, but now they have this treaty with another fairly large nation in Gibeon, or city in Gibeon, and so we pick up with chapter 10 and see what the response is from those around. So chapter 10, and its first section is chapter 10 and verses 1 through 5. Now it came to pass when Adonizedek, I'm going to just take a stab. I tried to look for pronunciations and it didn't work. King of Jerusalem heard how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it. As he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king. And how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, that they feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city and one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. Therefore Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, and Hoham, king of Hebron, Piram, king of Jarmuth, Japhia, king of Lachish, Debir, king of Eglon, saying, "Come up to me and help me, that we may attack Gibeon." I have been, even when I'm reading this to myself, I have said Gideon more often than I said Gibeon. "Come up to me and help me, that we may attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the children of Israel." Therefore 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, gathered together and went up, they and all their armies, and camped before Gibeon and made war with it. So, as we've said, these the kings of these nations, these cities, they have heard of the conquest of Israel. They've heard of what they've done to Ai. They've heard what they've done to Jericho. They know the history that they've told that God has told Moses that He will give them the lands and conquering of the people. And now this great royal city of Gibeon has created some kind of peace, and so they've got to do something about it. And from a military perspective, this is unacceptable. If you look at the map, for Israel to have made peace with Gibeon and its sister cities, they're right in the middle of this Canaanite area, and it creates a formidable foe for these other kings. And so they feel like, or at least Adonizedek of Jerusalem, the king of Jerusalem, which, we think of Jerusalem now as the capital of Israel, the heart of Israel, how the center of what we think of the Jewish nation or whatever. But, it was until David made it his capital in 2 Samuel chapter 5, it was just, another city. And it was led by this king who gathered these other kings together to war against Gibeon. And so I think this is kind of where we get into maybe the important part of this lesson. Like I said, we taught when I first read it, I thought, oh, this is really going to focus around the miracle, the sun standing still. But I think a real part of this lesson is the response that God has and the response that Joshua has, because setting up the history of this, what we talked about last week, and the fact that was Israel supposed to make this peace with Gibeon? No, they weren't. And in order to do it, Gibeon had to deceive Joshua and the people. And once we didn't read it, but you look back in chapter 9 and verse, let's see here, 18, but the children of Israel did not attack them because the rulers of the congregation had sworn to them by God of Israel, and all the congregation complained against the rulers. And all the rulers said to all the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel, now therefore we may not touch them. The congregation was not happy that they had been tricked. And I dare say Joshua probably wasn't either. But it is what it is, I guess, that you could say. They had made this treaty with Gibeon. And now, how do we respond? Because these 5 cities and the kings of them have decided they're going to stand against Gibeon. And the important thing I think that we can get out of this is what the response is from God and what the response is from Joshua and the nation of Israel. So let's go on and read the verses, and we'll talk about that. Chapter 6. And the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua at the camp at Gilgal, saying, do not forsake your servant. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the mountains have gathered together against us. So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand. Not a man of them shall stand before you. This turns into a test of, I guess the way it was put, a test of the faithfulness of God to his people. You see here the urgency in Gibeon's message. There in verse 7, verse 6. Do not forsake us. Come up to us quickly. Save us, or it could be translated, deliver us and help us. All of them, I think as I was reading the lesson text, I don't remember which book it was in, but they're all imperatives. Don't forsake us. Help us. Deliver us. Save us. They're stressing the fact that, they know that these 5 kings have banded together, and this mighty force can likely overrun them without help. We also learned that this treaty that they had signed with Joshua was apparently not just peace, not just for Israel to not attack Gibeon, but also a protective treaty, so that if someone came up against Gibeon, that Israel would come to their defenses. And so, are they going? Is is Joshua going to fulfill it? Is God going to, how are they going to respond? You know, when we look at the fact that when the treaty was made, they weren't happy. The nation of Israel wasn't happy. Joshua wasn't happy. And it would have been easy for Joshua to say, you know what, it'd serve you right. That's what you get. We're just going to step back, and that would take care of their problem. Let those 5 kings of the Amorite kings come in and wipe out Gibeon, and that takes care of the deception you caused us, and we'll just go about our way and conquest the rest of the land and move on. It would have been a perfect opportunity to get back to maybe where they thought they should have been in the first place. Conquering all the lands. But that wasn't Joshua's response, and it wasn't God's response either. Joshua kept his word, and God helped Joshua to keep his word that he in the treaty or the pact he made. In verse in verse 7. So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, he and all the mighty men of valor. Joshua did his part. He gathered his men together, and even though I would have to imagine the temptation would have been there to have just said, let's just turn our backs. But he didn't. Gibeon sent a call for help, and Joshua responded. And in turn, in verse 8, the Lord keeps his word. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand. Not a man of them shall stand before you. I don't know what the numbers were here. I don't know, we know that it was the 5 Amorite kings coming up against Israel and the men of Gibeon. We don't know. I don't know what the numbers were. I know that Joshua and the nation of Israel had faced pretty tough odds and in the past, and with the assurance of God and His power, they succeeded. In one of the references in 1 Samuel, chapter 14. In verse 6, it says, Then Jonathan said to the young men who bore his armor, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few. It didn't really matter the numbers. When God said to Joshua, don't be afraid of them, don't be afraid of them. Look back at Gideon, how few men God used there to go up against a large number. So regardless of what the numbers were and the situation, you have the 5 Amorite kings who are coming up against Gibeon. Gibeon says, come help us, and here comes Joshua, and God says, I'll take care of you. And so Joshua and the Lord both uphold their end of the bargain. And so how do they do it? And we go into verse 9. Joshua therefore came upon them suddenly, having marched all night from Gilgal. So the Lord routed them before Israel, killed them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, chased them along the road that goes to Beth-horon, and struck them down as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And it happened as they fled before Israel and were on the descent of Beth-horon that the Lord cast down large hailstones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than the children of Israel killed with the sword. And Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the people had revenge upon their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And there has been no day like that before it or after it, that the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. And then Joshua returned, and all the Israel with him, to the camp at Gilgal. What's interesting here is just how to heart Joshua took God's assurance. Once again, I can't remember which. We have these lesson books, and then we have the other companion books, and there's some differences, and so I can't keep straight sometimes where I read some of the material. But in one of them, it talks about where they had to march, from where they were and up to Gibeon and to protect them, and they marched all night, and it was essentially an uphill march. So they marched uphill all night and attacked. Now, what that tells that's probably not the most strategic way to do it. An all-night march uphill is probably going to leave your men relatively tired. Now, strategically it might be a surprise attack to attack first thing in the morning as soon as you get there, but not knowing the numbers, whatever, I don't think it was probably the most sound earthly strategy. But what did Joshua know? That God was on his side. With God, all things are possible. And Joshua knew that. Joshua had seen it. Joshua had experience of God being behind him. And so they finished this march. They marched all night uphill and still attacked. And they initiated a slaughter in verse 10 by the hands of the Israelites. The warring men of Israel killed them with a great slaughter and then sent them running. And then after they sent them running, God sends down hailstones and killed more with hailstones than the warring men of Israel had killed. And so it kind of goes back to what was it that God told Moses back in Exodus 23. Quick reference back, Exodus 23 and verse 27. I will send my fear before you. I will cause confusion among all the people to whom you come, and will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. They turned and ran, and even as they turned and ran, God helped. And God helped to deliver these Amorite kings to the hand of Joshua and Israel, and had their vengeance on them. But in order to complete the task, we get to this miracle that the lesson is titled on. And like I said, we spent more time leading up to it than talking about it itself, because I think, I believe the lesson here is one on God keeping his word. God and Joshua keeping his word. When you make a promise, you keep it. And even though it wasn't what God wanted to begin with, Joshua still followed through with what he promised to do, and God supported him. But we get to this point of Joshua says, "Sun, stand still. Moon, stand still. This is one of those miracles that it's obvious, it's clear that it was a miracle. The sun doesn't just stand still. The moon doesn't just stop on an average day." Especially at the words of a man. We don't have much more details as to exactly what it meant. Most think that it kept daylight long enough for the task to be completed. I think it's interesting that it references this book of Jasher. That's obviously not an inspired work. It's the book of Jasher has been lost to time. I think it's also interesting that it's referenced again. If you look in 2 Samuel chapter 1, In verse 18, the book of Jasher is referenced there as well, saying basically the same thing. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? Bible scholars today do some of the. This was clearly a secular work because, like I said, it's has not been preserved as an inspired work. But Bible scholars use secular works. The works of Josephus have been referenced time and time again as a contemporary of the time, and I don't know why they felt like they needed to bring it up. Maybe the book of Jasher was a pretty well known, important work that they would know that a lot of people had read it. But it's mentioned, and the sun stands still, the moon stops, the task is completed, and there was never a day before it, and hasn't been a day since like that day when the sun stood still. This is one of those things where as children of God, and we just have to accept that there was some kind of miracle at play here, and God, in a lot of ways, helped Israel with their conquests. The unfortunate thing that I think that comes out of this is, through the years, how many of you have heard, I don't know what you want to call it, Christian scientists or apologetics, apologists, whatever, try to come up with some explanation for this day? I mean, I've heard it. As scientists look back at time, they can find the I don't know, a gap in astronomical calendars that show a gap. And time again over the years, these explanations have been explained or debunked or whatever. I think it does more harm than good to try to explain something like this, because you're not going to explain the sun standing still. With Christian scientists, I don't know how else to say it, but who want to find an explanation for everything, sometimes do more harm than good to find an explanation that is so easily discredited. Instead of just accepting that God said the sun stood still and the sun stood still. We don't need to find a gap in the astronomical calendar to understand that God works miracles, and that God helped the nation of Israel, and God helped Joshua keep his word. And so the sun stands still, and the moon stops, and the task was completed, and I think that's good enough. So what happens afterward? What happens after is basically exactly what the Amorite kings were trying to prevent. This isn't in the text, but of the lesson. But we don't cover this in any future lesson, so I wanted to wrap up the story. In verse 26, and afterwards Joshua struck them and killed them, and hanged them on 5 trees, and they were hanging on the trees until evening. And so it was at the time of the going down of the sun that Joshua commanded, and they took them down from the trees, cast them into the cave where they had been hidden, and laid large stones against the cave's mouth, which remain until this very day. It sounds familiar to what they had heard coming out of the king of Ai. Although these kings weren't stacked upon a heap of stones, but they had in their retreat, they had hidden in a cave, and they were brought out of the cave where they were hidden and hung and killed, and then put back in the cave. And so exactly what they had heard was going on, that they had tried to avoid, to try to prevent, the same thing happened to them. And so, what are the applications of this lesson? What do we get out of this lesson? From my perspective, it's like I've already said once, it's keeping your word. I think the chapters 9 and 10 are one complete account that set the stage for one another to say, even though you were deceived into it. Even though Joshua was deceived and maybe tricked into making this peace treaty, he still kept his word. And God helped him do so. And then another one are the assurances that we receive from God. God told Joshua, don't worry about it. I'm going to deliver them into your hand. And so he had no hesitation to march all night uphill and attack at morning against probably a large, I would probably imagine a large force, maybe even outnumbered. But he knew that God said that he was going to be with him, and God said that he would deliver them into his hand, so he went forward. And the last point in our lesson text as far as applications, God's willingness to hear and answer Joshua's prayer reminds us that we serve a God who is living and active, that still hears and answers the prayers of his children. And so, with a lesson that was titled The Sun Stands Still, we sure didn't talk about the sun standing still much, but I think we got a lot out of this lesson, and I appreciate your attention. I think I heard the first bell, so maybe we're wrapped up just a couple minutes early. Thank you.